Every church and ministry needs to ask itself, how are we going to draw new people to our ministry? What are we going to do to engage new people and bring them in? This is going to be largely dependent on the context where we find ourselves. For example, in the ministry of the Apostle Paul, he would often go first to the synagogue, he would appeal to the Jews, then he would appeal to God-fearing Gentiles, and then eventually the larger Gentile community. But sometimes he had a different strategy, like when he went to Athens in Acts 17, and he went to go to reach the people in that city in a different method. And so our context is going to determine how we go about attracting people, inviting people to our church, to our ministry. If you are a missionary in Indonesia and you're working among a Muslim context, you're going to have to do a lot of work to make friends with Indonesians, and you're going to have to build relationships, and you're going to have to begin to have some conversations about the nature of God and start in sort of a one-on-one relationship. It'll help if you befriend a village chief and get some insight that way. If you live in Portland, Oregon, downtown Portland, Oregon, and you want to reach people with the gospel, you're talking to people who don't really understand or don't have much of a history in formal religion. And so you're going to have to build bridges in other ways, maybe have some conversations about the Bible and God in a coffee shop long before anyone ever comes to visit your church. So we're specifically talking about what it's like living in Utah and reaching Mormons, former Mormons, in this context. I believe the best way to attract LDS or former LDS people into your ministry is to create an environment where you can welcome them into your church service. I think that for the most part, the best way to reach this group of people, which, some people will be Mormons, some people will be former Mormons, some people will be people who've been heavily influenced by the Mormon church. Whatever they come in that larger group of people, there's a strong sense within the Mormon culture that in order to encounter God, it's going to be tied to a church-going experience. As we said, that's different than other parts of America, parts that are less religious and more secular. But for most Utahns, they're going to think, when they think of encountering God, connecting with God, growing in their faith, they're going to tie that to a religious experience. And if you are interested in reaching Utahns with the gospel, you can use this to your advantage. Now, many Mormons as they leave the Mormon church will reject formal religion, but many others will be searching for God and searching for the spiritual, and they are likely to do that through a church. So this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to present the gospel to people. There are many people at our church who are former Mormons who came to our church because they had left the Mormon church and they were still looking for God, and they thought the church would be the best place to do that. I have a friend who's actually now a pastor at our church. The first time that he and his wife came to our church, they sought us out because they wanted a church that just taught the Bible. Now, I know there's a lot of complexities to just teaching the Bible, quote unquote, but that's what they were looking for. And by the providence of God, they found our church. And so the point is, their first instinct after leaving Mormonism, but still being interested in God, was to seek out a church. And so I believe that if we want to be good missionaries, the best way to really reach Mormons and former Mormons is to make our churches, ministries, attractional, safe, and welcome spaces where people can find a relationship with God. This means that we need to design our church services and our ministries in a way that are contextually relevant and meaningful for LDS people. So your church should look different. It should be influenced by the fact that you are reaching people from an LDS worldview. Instead of saying, well, this is just how our church operates, whether we were in Alabama or Hawaii or Colorado, this is how we do church, I would say, no, that's not the most effective way, nor is it the New Testament pattern. Instead, I think God calls us to adapt our church to the needs of our surrounding community. This is what we find, I believe, in the book of Acts over and over again, the church adapting to their context. Now, when we say that as a church we need to adapt to the context of the people around us, there are a few things that we're not saying here. There, as we talk about an attractional model, as I'm encouraging you to be attractional for your LDS neighbors and friends, there are a few things that I'm not saying. This doesn't mean, to be attractional, that we get rid of elements in the church that the Bible demands but the Mormon culture finds hard to accept. For example, we're not going to just get rid of communion or get away with baptism because we want to reach our culture. Like maybe there's some who think, well, baptism is kind of awkward for a Mormon visitor, Mormon guest, or to witness, or communion kind of gets in the way with what we're trying to do, so we need to eliminate those things. No, we can't do that because the Bible mandates baptism and communion. We don't eliminate worship or the preaching of the word in order to find something that's more relevant to Mormons. There are certain biblical mandates that we must adhere to. Now, this also doesn't mean that we incorporate as many Mormon elements into our services as possible. So in other words, we're not trying to just sort of make a Christianized version of a Mormon service. Instead, what is helpful is to look at some Mormon values, to look at some things that are important to Mormons, something about the Mormon worldview, and look to see where we can build bridges to the gospel. But now that we've kind of said, here's what we're not doing, I think that a good principle is that when the Bible gives us freedom, we should adapt ourselves to the culture that God has put us into. In other words, like the words of the Apostle Paul, we want to be all things to all people that we might win some, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And so every church, every ministry, as they answer this question, how do we draw new people into our church, especially as we're thinking in a Mormon context, how can we be attractional, how can we be welcoming, how can we be safe? What is that point of entry? At our church, we call that our gateway service. What is the gateway for our church? The gateway for our church is the gateway service. This is the broadest point of entry for people coming to our church. And I believe, as I've said earlier, and I'll say again, that the best gateway to reach Mormons in a church is that Sunday morning church service, or perhaps if you have a Saturday night church service, or a Sunday night church service. But that is still the most typical way that a former Mormon, is going to be checking out, visiting your church, your ministry for the first time, would be through a church service. And so in other videos, we'll talk about how to construct a gateway service with the Mormon in mind. But for now, let's ask ourselves, how is the best way to bring new people in? How can we create that welcoming space? And how can we change what we do to better serve our Mormon neighbors to win them to Christ?